What do you think is most satisfying revenge for your spouse who cheated and broke your heart? The story begins at the grand opening of an art gallery. After the event, the gallery curator, Susan, sits alone, looking sad and distant. Later that night, she returns to her massive, luxurious mansion. She can't sleep, so she stays up all night watching TV until the morning. When morning comes, her butler brings her a package that arrived in the mailbox. It's a manuscript, a novel written by her ex-husband, Edward. Inside is a note from Edward saying that he wrote the book after she left him, and he wants her to be the first to read it before it gets published in the spring. He also mentions that he's currently in LA and hopes to see her again after all this time. Later, Susan's husband, Hutton, comes home. Susan asks why he didn't show up at the gallery last night. Hutton apologizes and says if he had stopped by, he would have been late for his dinner meeting. Susan tells him that even just 15 minutes of his time would have meant a lot. Then she asks why he didn't come to bed the night before. He claims he didn't want to wake her, but Susan says she was awake all night. She invites him to spend the weekend with her at the beach, just the two of them, but Hutton says he needs to go back to the office and then fly out to New York. Susan is confused because he just got back from there. Hutton insists the deal he's working on is important and that he has to return. We learn that his business is struggling and the couple is slowly running out of money. That evening, they attend a party at a friend's house. One of Susan's friends notices that she looks stressed and asks if she's okay. Susan admits that even though she has everything, money, status, success, she still feels deeply unhappy. She asks her friend Alessia how she manages to stay happy in her marriage. Alessia says it's because her husband is gay, they're best friends, they love each other fully, and she knows she's the only woman in his life. Susan says she's never had that kind of connection with Hutton. Their conversation is interrupted when Hutton says he has to leave for New York. Susan wishes him luck, knowing how badly he needs his deal to work out. Back at home, Susan takes some sleeping pills and begins reading Edward's novel. She sees her name on the dedication page. The story inside the novel begins with a family driving down a quiet interstate highway on their way to Texas. The father, Tony, is behind the wheel with his wife, Laura, in the passenger seat and their teenage daughter, India, in the back. India complains that she lost phone signal. Tony jokes that what he loves about West Texas is that there are no phones and no people. After a while, they get stuck behind two slow-moving cars. Tony honks, and one of them pulls aside to let him pass. But a few minutes later, the cars speed up, chase after them, and start acting aggressive. One car rams into them from behind. Then both vehicles force Tony's car off the road and block them. A man named Ray gets out and accuses Tony of hitting their car. Tony tries to stay calm and suggests they call the police. But one of the other men says Tony can't because he has a flat tire. Tony doesn't believe him, so Ray tells him to drive and see for himself. Tony tries to move the car, but the tire really is flat. Ray offers to help fix it to show they're good guys. Left with no choice, Tony gets out and opens the trunk for the spare tire. Ray then tells him to bring his wife and daughter out of the car because they need to lift it with the jack. Though scared, Laura and India get out. Ray starts acting inappropriately toward India. Tony tries to stop him, but Ray punches him hard. Tony backs off, not wanting to make things worse. After the tire is fixed, Laura and India quickly try to get into their car. But Ray and the other man jump in and speed off with them, leaving Tony behind. He freezes in shock, helplessly watching as his wife and daughter are taken away. Before he can react, they vanish into the night. Back in the real world, Susan slams the book shut, breathing heavily. The suspense is too much. She calls her husband, who is at a hotel. A woman is by his side, holding his arm. Susan asks why he didn't call when he landed in New York. Hutton repeats the same excuse, he didn't want to wake her. As they talk, he tells the elevator operator to go to floor 31. Susan is confused because that's not their usual floor. Hutton says their regular room wasn't available. When they arrive, the operator says, 31, madam. That moment confirms Susan's worst suspicion. Her husband is cheating on her. She quietly tells him to take care and hangs up the phone. Tony is left with one of the men, a guy named Lou, who tells him to get in the car and drive. Tony is terrified and keeps looking around the roadside, hoping to see his wife and daughter. He spots his car parked next to a trailer, but there's no one in sight. Lou tells him to stop worrying, saying Ray wouldn't hurt his wife or daughter. But Tony isn't convinced. Lou leads him to a dark, empty area, pulls him out of the car, and leaves him there all alone. Tony walks along the road through the night, exhausted and scared, until he finally finds a house. He knocks and asks if he can use the phone. A police officer named Lieutenant Bobby answers and listens to Tony's story. Together, they retrace Tony's steps from the night before. Bobby is confused. He doesn't understand why Tony just let the men drive off with his wife and daughter, especially since they didn't even have guns. They reach a barbed wire fence and decide to walk the rest of the way. In the middle of nowhere, Tony stops cold. In front of him, lying naked and lifeless on a red couch, are his wife and daughter. Susan gasps and begins crying at what she just read. She puts the book down and has a flashback to the time she bumped into her ex-husband Edward in New York. Edward looks a lot like Tony, the character in the novel, but without the beard. They're both from Texas. Edward is in New York for a scholarship interview at Columbia, while Susan is already in grad school there. They go out for dinner, and Edward tells her that she was his very first crush. When he says Susan has the same eyes as her mom, she gets upset and says she doesn't want to be anything like her mother. Edward then asks her why she gave up on being an artist, and Susan says it's because she's too cynical. Edward tells her she's too hard on herself. That makes Susan smile, and she invites him to come home with her. She then confesses that he was her first crush too. Edward smiles. Back in the novel, Lieutenant Bobby tells Tony that they've learned how his wife and daughter died. His wife had a cracked skull, and his daughter had a broken arm and suffocated. Both were also sexually assaulted. Bobby adds that at the trailer, the same one where Tony saw his car parked that night, they found fingerprints from both his wife and daughter. They're now trying to track down who owns the trailer. Susan has another flashback. This time, she's having dinner with her mother. Her mother is upset because Susan wants to leave New York and go back to Texas to marry Edward. Her mother doesn't like Edward at all. She thinks he's weak and not good enough for their family. Susan defends him, but her mother warns that one day she'll regret it. She says Edward won't be able to give Susan the life of comfort and luxury she deserves. Then her mother says something that shakes Susan. She claims that Susan may not realize it now, but she's more like her mother than she thinks. Susan disagrees and says they're nothing alike. Her mother calmly replies, "Just wait." Back in the present, Susan writes an email to Edward. She tells him that his book moved her deeply and she would like to see him. Back in the novel, Bobby sends Tony an email with a photo of a man named Turk, their only lead. Tony confirms that Turk was one of the men from that night. But Bobby says Turk hasn't been seen in a while. Weeks and months pass, and there's still no real progress in the investigation. During this time, we see that Tony has shaved his beard. He looks different now. One day, Bobby meets with Tony and tells him that 3 men recently tried to rob a supermarket. One got away, one was arrested, and one was shot and killed. The man who died is Turk. Bobby asks Tony to come to the station to see if he can recognize the man who was caught. At the station, Tony immediately points him out. It's Lou, the one who left him in the desert. Lou tries to pretend he doesn't know Tony, but Tony reminds him of what they did to his wife and daughter. Bobby asks Lou about Ray and Turk, but Lou denies knowing anything. Bobby locks him up and tells Tony that with his testimony and the fingerprints from the car and trailer, they're going to charge Lou with murder. Bobby also believes Ray was the 3rd man in the robbery, the one who escaped, and he promises Tony that they'll catch him. Meanwhile, Susan is at work. Her assistant reminds her about a meeting, but Susan seems distracted. The assistant asks if she didn't sleep again, and Susan says she never sleeps. That's why her ex-husband used to call her a nocturnal animal. Susan thinks it's strange that Edward sent her a novel so dark and painful, and that he gave it the same name he used to call her. Her assistant gently asks if Susan loved her ex-husband. She says yes, but she admits that she didn't believe in him or in his writing. She also confesses that she did something terrible to Edward. She left him, and in a cruel way, for Hutton, the charming and successful man she thought would offer her a better life. At the meeting, the board is talking about firing an employee. Susan disagrees, saying they should support the employees since they're the ones who hired her in the first place. One of the board members reminds her that she was the one pushing for changes in the company. Susan replies, "Sometimes it's not good to change what was," which may reflect how she feels about the changes she made in her own life. Back to the novel, Bobby takes Tony to a house where Ray is currently staying. Bobby tells Tony that Ray has no fingerprints of the crime scene and his record is clean. But Tony insists he's completely sure that Ray is the man responsible. The two walk up to Ray and invite him to come to the station. While driving, Bobby casually asks Ray if he recognizes the car or the man driving it. Ray replies that he has no idea. Tony, holding back tears, turns around and stares at Ray. He tells Ray exactly what he and his friends did to his wife and daughter. Ray just laughs and says Tony must be crazy. Bobby puts handcuffs on Ray and drives him to the trailer where everything happened that night. At the trailer, Tony demands that Ray tell the truth about what really happened. But Ray keeps denying it. Tony loses control and punches him in the face. Flashback to the past. Susan and Edward are still together. Susan is reading one of Edward's early drafts. After finishing, she tells him she doesn't think it's good enough. She says he should consider doing something else instead of writing. Edward is hurt. Susan says she's just being honest, she doesn't see a future in his writing. Edward says she's starting to sound like her mother. They begin to argue. Not long after that, Susan meets Hutton, the man who would later become her second husband. Back to the novel, Bobby calls Tony with bad news. Ray has been released due to a lack of solid evidence. They meet at a diner where Bobby shares something personal. He has lung cancer and only has about a year left to live. He says he's being forced to retire soon, but he refuses to walk away from this case. He wants to bring justice for Tony's family no matter what it takes. This will be his final case, and he won't let a killer go free. Another flashback, this time to the moment Susan breaks up with Edward. She tells him that their relationship just isn't working. She says they're too different and she wants a better life. Edward pleads with her not to leave, but Susan is firm. She says she's unhappy and wants a different future. In the novel, Bobby finds Ray again at a bar and arrests him. He takes him back to his hideout. Ray protests, saying it's illegal to arrest someone without proof, but Bobby ignores him. A little later, another officer shows up with Lou. Bobby suddenly feels sick and tells Tony to hold the gun for a moment while he throws up. Outside, chaos breaks loose. Lou tries to run, but Bobby manages to shoot and kill him. Ray, however, escapes once again. Flashback, Susan is in a clinic with Hutton. Sitting in the car, she looks sad and says she regrets what she did. She's scared Edward might find out. That's when we learn the truth. Susan just had an abortion and the baby was Edward's. Hutton tries to comfort her and says Edward will never know. But then they see Edward standing nearby, outside their car, crying. It's a heartbreaking moment. We realize now that Edward's quiet and gentle nature led him to lose not just his wife, but his unborn child. He poured all that pain into his novel, creating the character Tony, whose own soft nature led to losing his wife and daughter. Back to the novel. Tony looks down at Lou's dead body and begins to scream. His emotions overwhelm him. He's filled with guilt, thinking that maybe if he had fought harder, he could have saved his family. Bobby comforts him, telling him he's a good man. Then he tells Tony to get up, they still have to find Ray. The two go separate ways to search. Tony finally drives to the trailer house and finds Ray there. He points the gun at him. Ray laughs, mocking Tony, saying he's too weak to do anything. Then he makes it worse. He admits to what he did to Tony's wife and daughter. He even says he enjoyed it. As Ray keeps taunting him, Tony pulls the trigger and shoots. But before Ray drops, he manages to hit Tony hard in the face with a crowbar. Tony blacks out. When he wakes up, his eye is injured and he can barely see. He crawls across the floor, trying to find his way. He kicks Ray's body and Ray is dead. Tony stumbles outside, but in a tragic turn, he accidentally falls on his own gun. Lying on the ground, struggling to breathe, Tony takes his last few breaths and dies. In real life, Susan is taking a bath. Out of nowhere, her thoughts drift back to Edward. Later in bed, she receives an email from him. He asks her when and where she'd like to meet. The next day, Susan gets dressed up. She even takes off her wedding ring. She looks in the mirror and smiles. She's excited to see Edward again. She arrives at the restaurant and waits for him. She waits for hours, but Edward never shows up. Susan sits alone, tears in her eyes. In that moment, she begins to realize the full weight of her past choices, leaving Edward, choosing Hutton, ending her pregnancy. All of it has led her to this. A broken marriage, a sad life, and deep regret. Did you enjoy the recap? Please like and subscribe, and hit the notification bell to be updated next time we drop. Thanks for watching.